cliff. What's going on here? There's not much to say there. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. This week we're going to be talking about something known as the glass cliff. It is this phenomenon and it's fascinating, so I can't wait to talk about it. So most likely if you're here on my feminist channel, you'll have heard of the glass ceiling, which is basically like that, you know, women can only reach a certain level in like leadership positions or their professional life, and there's just a ceiling that's holding them back and they can't reach blah blah blah. The glass cliff is basically like the sister phenomenon, and it's so interesting. So we're going to talk about what is it, the reasons behind it, why we think it's happening, some examples of it in real life. It is a whole thing, and then maybe what we can do to help, or some interesting things that we should think about when we talk about the glass cliff. So before we get into the discussion, I would love if you subscribe down there to see more videos like this, and now let's get started. So in a nutshell, the glass cliff is this phenomenon where women are appointed, like CEO for example, of companies when they're failing. It's a really interesting thing, and basically the term glass cliff was coined back in 2005 by two researchers, Michelle Ryan and Alexander Haslam. And obviously, as we know, there is the glass ceiling, so it is harder for women to rise up to these positions, whether that's, a CEO of a big company or like the leader of a country, like these kind of things. So it is harder to get those positions. And they started noticing that so many women were only achieving these really high ranking positions during times of crisis, so whether it's a crisis in a company or a crisis in a country. And they were kind of like, okay, this is really interesting, like women are never appointed these positions, but yet here we are, have loads of them appointed during times of crisis. Like, what's going on here? And if you think about it, if it's a time of crisis, like if the company is failing, if the country is going through turmoil, the chance of failing is highest. So they were kind of like, well, why are women being put into the positions where the chance of failing is really high? Like, is that not really bad and dodgy yet? Like, what's going on here? This has been around for like 16 years, but why it's interesting now is that because, there's the coronavirus pandemic, the world has gone to shit. There is, obviously more and more push for diversity. And so like the glass cliff phenomenon is becoming more prevalent because there's more chance of companies or countries being in distress and being in turmoil. Coupled with the push for diversity, there's more chance that women are going to be put into these roles, and that those roles are going to be there for women to be put into. And what's just kind of like really just dodgy is that, like, obviously if it's a crisis, if your company is failing, it's gonna be like really hard to turn that around. So there's a high probability of failure. And so when women are put into these positions, which are extremely rare, they're already hard to begin with, the company or the country is already failing, then they fail, and it reinforces the idea that women can't lead. And like, we have already so much to work against that it's like we really don't need that narrative on us. And it can either like make it harder for you to get a job like next time around, because everyone's like, oh well, she failed, she's bad, blah blah blah. Or something else kind of opposite of that I saw is that if you're seen as a kind of person to bring in, if you say you're successful, you're then maybe seen as someone who is, okay, you bring them in times of crisis, and your CV becomes all these jobs where you're just constantly leading companies or countries or whatever. That obviously would be country because you're going to lead in probably one country, but in companies where there is crisis and you're constantly dealing with that pressure and that stress, and you're pigeonholed into that group, and you're seen as, oh, she'll save us, but you're never appointed a leader of a thriving company where things are going great and you're making money and it's maybe happy and less stressed. And it's just a really interesting thing to think about, I think. So what are some of the reasons we think that people think that why this happens? If we're looking at both negative and positive ones, well, I feel like they're all negative, and both negative and positive. But one of them is, like women are seen to have the traits needed in times of crisis. Like, oh, bring her in and she'll save the day. It's just so funny. If you think of like movies or something, like it's always like, oh, men save the day. And the women are like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Like, rescue me. Like, what? But then in real life, like, oh yeah, bring her in, she'll save the day. Like, clean up our mess. Like, what? Because women just clean. Oh. Obviously, like a negative take on that is that just, we want to set women up for failure. That, the world hates women, as they do. And we're just like, yeah, like, the company's going to fail anyway, so might as well have a woman at the top leading it who will get, who will get the blame. And yeah, and her life will be ruined and her reputation, and yeah, so let's just, send her out to be slaughtered. Like, another interesting reason why this might be a thing is that if a company is failing or if a country is failing and there's this mess, that a non-male leader would attract more sympathy. That's a reason I saw. And that might help people, you know, it might make people want to help the company or help the country, which is quite interesting, you know, it's something to think about. Or another reason I saw was that, like, this whole, you know, tokenism, that, like, you know, that the company or the country can say, look, no, we're changing, like, we've appointed a woman or, you know, a person of color as the leader, like, yeah, we're changing, you know, this is good. And yeah, I mean, probably nothing has changed except the leader. And that might be like why they then appoint, you know, a woman or a person of color as the leader, to be like, yeah, we're changing, you know, things are, and just to, yeah, I don't know, instill confidence in people or investors or, you know, constituents or whatever. So yeah, it's just, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on why this happens, but like, I mean, of course, we live in a sexist world. Of course, something like this is going to happen. So what are some examples of this happening in the real world? I have 4 here. There are many more. I won't go into too much detail because it would just take way too long, but I encourage you to like go Google them and look at their stories. And it's just, yeah, it's kind of like one of those things where you start seeing like 1 or 2 examples and you might notice it like everywhere now. It's really interesting. So first off is Marissa Mayer. She was appointed the CEO of Yahoo in 2014. And obviously Yahoo, I mean, like do any of us use Yahoo anymore? Like obviously it was struggling to compete with Google, you know, compete with other search engines, like, and just like, I mean, what? So basically she was just brought in at a time where they were just like, what is going on? She was CEO for 5 years. Now she's doing other bits, but yeah, it's an interesting case and it was quite famous at the time actually. Fascinating one is Theresa May. When she was appointed Prime Minister, when Brexit had just happened, obviously the UK was just, I mean, the UK is a whole other story, but you know, around that time particularly, it was just insanity. She was never going to thrive. Like, she was never, and obviously her personal politics aside or whatever, but even, you know, she was never going to have a good time. Like, that was just never ever going to happen. And again, it was just so interesting that it was a woman appointed when that country is, obviously, you know, Maggie Thatcher aside, has been very like, oh, old white boys club. Like, it was just, yeah, makes you think. And now they have Boris Johnson and, you know, there's not much to say there. Another really interesting example is Jill Soltau. She was appointed the CEO of JCPenney in the States in 2018. Basically, their previous CEO had like tried to introduce like electronics or something into the company. It did not work. I think they're like primarily clothes or something, and failing, she was appointed to try and clean it up. And she resigned like only like last December. I think the coronavirus came into the mix there, but again, it was just like, why was a woman only appointed CEO when you were literally dying? And then finally, a really interesting example and quite high profile was when Carly Fiorina was appointed CEO of Hewlett Packard. Basically, yeah, I think again, they were failing, they weren't doing well, and she proposed this merger with another company, and it was gonna, you know, take the company in a new direction and make them thrive and blah, blah, blah. Apparently, she basically got into a rift with, you know, one of the Hewletts or one of the Packards or one of them, and they didn't go ahead with the merger, the company failed, and then like a few months later, basically, they admitted that the merger would have been the good thing to do and would have been the right thing to do and would have saved the company, and she was ousted, and it was just like this big mess. And again, it was just like, why are women only brought in when the company is failing and in turmoil? Like, what's going on? So those are just 4 examples. I encourage you to look into those and look at more. It's just super, super interesting. So now, what can we do about it, or what do we take from this? So like, if we admit that the glass cliff is a thing, like, what does that mean? Do we just leave it there? Like, you know, we say like, okay, this is a really like negative thing, but like where do we go from this? So it's super interesting, but we do need to be careful about how we talk about it. So like, instead of saying like, oh, this is really bad and like leaving it there, we should really be talking about, okay, well, we know this is a thing, but how do we then like support those women who are appointed to those roles to thrive and to actually do well? And what's fascinating is like, we talk about, you know, women almost like, oh, women are being duped and they're being lured to the cliff and they're bound to fall off. Like, it creates this really like negative picture of like women that we're, you know, oh, like we don't know what's going on, and we're just like, you know, lambs being led to the slaughter unknowingly, and we're just like, oh my god, what's going on? Like, women are not like that. So it's like, we need to talk about it in a way that we're like, okay, this is a thing. Women do seem to be appointed to companies or countries in turmoil, but they're also not oblivious. They're not idiots. They're not just like sacrificial lambs. Like, you know, women are strong and capable, and they're not meek and unaware. So it's yeah, there's kind of a balance to be struck there. And you know, if your response to knowing about the glass cliff is like, oh well, don't appoint women to those positions, so like that's also not really probably the best way to go about it, because one, like as we know from the glass ceiling, like women have a hard time getting to those positions. So it's not really worth saying, well, don't take it. Like, you know, this opportunity might, even though it's maybe a bad opportunity, the opportunity might not come around that often, so you might still want to take it. So it's, you know, the ending of this is not, oh well, don't take leadership positions. It's like, well, you know, maybe take them, but just be aware. And how can we support women when they get to those positions? It also insinuates that, like, you know, even if you fail, that there's nothing to learn from that. Like, as we all know, when you fail, you learn so much. So again, we can talk about how the likelihood is failure and that women might be being propped up to fail, but like that also doesn't have to be a completely negative thing. Like, how can we learn from that? How can we turn that around? And like, we should also be looking at like these previous examples, like the ones I mentioned, and like if they failed, like learning what did you learn? Like what can you teach other women who maybe be in this position? And like, again, make it so that like this might keep happening, but make it so that the chance of failure is less and less likely, and that like women then aren't seen as people that you just bring in times of crisis, or don't have it seen that, you know, women can only fail. You know, like we want women to succeed when they are inevitably potentially put in these positions. So how can we make that happen? Like, again, even to get to the point where you would be appointed like CEO of a big company or leader of a country, like you're already so successful if you've even gotten to that stage where you're being considered. Like, obviously Theresa May, you know, like climbed way up the ranks before she was appointed prime minister. Like, that should be looked at like that should be seen as, you know, even if we see it as a negative thing, like, oh, she was sent off the glass cliff, like it should be like, okay, well, how did she get there in the first place? Like that, and not just Theresa May, but like, you know, every woman who has risen up somewhere, like that should be looked at. That's quite cool. Like, how can we make more of that, and then how can we ensure that that continues and that you're not just sent off this glass cliff to die? So to wrap it up, I think it's super, super interesting. Yes, we can acknowledge that this phenomenon is a thing, but we can also look at ways to combat it. So I think it's fascinating. Really would encourage you to learn more and like try and see when you like spot it happening in the world. Bottom line, like, this is probably going to still happen, but we need to support women when they get into those positions and ensure that in general, like, it's not great when companies fail, not only for the leader of that company or the leader of that country, but for everybody else. So we should all have this collective interest in supporting women when they are potentially put on this glass cliff. So that is this week's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Please do subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this, and maybe comment down below if you know of another example of this happening, and give the video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.